begin with breaking news from overseas.
They are the sorts of cases that often do not make the news and do not have happy endings. Journalists, contractors, and activists are routinely taken by kidnappers in the Middle East, especially in war-ravaged Syria. So in 2014, when a young American man on a humanitarian mission went missing in Syria, an old hand was brought in to find him.
This is not the kind of risk where I'm parachuting into a war zone completely cut off from any context. This is a manageable kind of risk.
Levin recounts his 20 days on the hunt for a missing person in the Middle East in his new book, Proof of Life. It's the gripping story of a search populated by a cast of repugnant characters.
These people didn't become extremely wealthy drug lords or militia leaders by being dumb. And so I don't march into their thinking that I can outwit them.
You might think the surest way to get a missing person returned is to offer money. But in a part of the world where leverage is coin of the realm, hostage-taking is not always about paying a ransom.
I saw this in Syria several times where a hostage is taken by one group and then traded often from that group to another group that on its face is a war enemy. The human beings are treated in a war economy no different than any other commodity.
To Levin, paying ransom is never a good option, and neither is being paid himself when he goes hunting for the missing.
When you deal with people's lives, the best thing you can do is keep this really at the level of just seeing what you can do to help a person. And if it works out well, then the happiness of everyone involved is really all the pay you want.
Daniel Levin, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me.
We want to let folks know that your book, Proof of Life, 20 Days on the Hunt for a Missing Person in the Middle East, is available locally at The Novel Neighbor in Webster Groves. I'm curious, Daniel, on your federal tax form at the bottom where they have a line that says occupation, what do you put? What exactly is it that you do?
I'm an attorney, so that's been the designation for the last 35 years. But my wife has been asking me for the 26 years we've known each other also what it is exactly I do for a living. So you're not the first person who's puzzled.
So what is it exactly you do for a living?
I really was trained as an attorney. Actually, initially had an academic career and then worked as a lawyer for many years. The last 11, 12 years, I've run a European foundation that works in failed states trying to develop new constitutions and train next generation leaders. And so some of it's legal because a lot of constitutional work and some of it's mediation because you end up working in war zones. But it really is, I mean, the core of my expertise, to the extent I have any, is legal.
Well, then why is it people come to you asking you to help find missing people? Because this wasn't the first time this has happened.
That's correct. Well, our foundation is really active, as I said earlier, in countries that either have been shattered by civil war and are trying to emerge from it, or countries sometimes still in the midst of it. And then when kidnapping started, because we had good relationships with the different sides to the war, families approached us, in some cases also governments approached us, and see whether we could just obtain some information on who exactly was even holding the missing people. And this started in 12 and 13. And this particular story that I write about in Proof of Life is something that occurred in late 2014.
The young man you're looking for in the book is named Paul Blocker, or at least that's the name you give him. We know that that's a pseudonym. Has gone missing, presumably in Syria. Why did you decide to take on this case? It was pretty daunting.
Had I had a moment to think about it and not been roped in even emotionally, I would have probably declined. This request had come to late 2014 on the heels of a very disappointing experience where I had failed miserably to get information on a missing hostage who later turned out had been executed. And I was so shaken up by that experience really very shortly before this request that I really wouldn't have taken anything on, certainly not for a while. But this person approached me. This was someone I'd met 2 years earlier. We weren't exactly friends, but I knew him pretty well. He was a very well-connected individual. But he had been introduced to me by someone whom I considered almost a father figure and a mentor. And I felt an obligation to at least see what I could do. So after we had our initial meeting and he told me what had happened, I contacted a friend of mine to just see whether it might even be in the cards. Because it does happen that I get approached, and after initial investigation, I have to go back to the person and say, I'm sorry, I can't help you, for a number of reasons, either because I really won't be in a position to get information, or in some cases because I find out that there are negotiations for ransom payments. And if the group holding the hostage is a group that's designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. government, then it's illegal to negotiate. So there are a number of factors that would cause me to decline. In this case, because after my initial call to my contact, I found out that there might be a possibility to at least get information, I found myself just roped into it before I had a clear head and had a chance to say no.
This was a case that received no publicity prior to this young man's disappearance or even later. Why not?
I think as consumers of news, we got accustomed to these things being known, when in fact there are quite a few Western hostages, not to mention, of course, local Syrian prisoners, but Western hostages who are being held by various groups, from the regime to Islamic opposition groups to drug dealers, where their names are not made public. And the main reason not to do that is when families approach me before it's been made public, my advice is to hold off, because once you make it public, the first reaction of most groups that hold the hostages is, because mostly they hold them for money. And when the name is made public, when you get a lot of requests and pleas from different sides, from governments to intelligence agencies to media, the first instinct of the hostage takers is to assume that they have a high value asset. And the immediate next step is to get at totally stratospheric hostage demands, ransom demands, and in most cases that leads directly to having to decline it and to an execution. So before we even know who has someone, the best advice I can give the families is please don't go public with this yet until we have more information. And there are currently, just to my knowledge, and I certainly don't have the complete picture, just to my knowledge, I'm aware of 12 Westerners being held in Syria, Americans, Canadians, British, just from those three countries alone, where the names have never been made public. And I was involved in two individuals who ended up being released, where even after the release, the fact that they were taken hostage was not made public, because there's a possibility that you jeopardize those who haven't been released. So there's this whole dark world here in the case of hostage taking in war zones, and Syria is not alone, where this never makes the public news.
Yeah, and as you point out in the book, it's not necessarily just for ransom. Sometimes the hostages are taken just to trade for other people.
That's correct. I mean, I saw this in Syria several times, where a hostage is taken by one group and then traded often from that group to another group that on its face is a war enemy. So I've seen hostages taken by the regime and traded to the Islamist militias, to ISIS or to Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, for something else. It could be for heating oil or for medicine or for drugs or for weapons. And they're often 3-4 party trades. So humans are treated there, and the same, by the way, for young girls who are taken and sold into sex slavery. So the human beings are treated in a war economy no different than any other commodity. There's absolutely no other empathy or emotion tied into that. And when a captor is convinced that the hostage has no value, the most likely consequence of that is to execute the hostage. So you're riding a very fine line here. By not making it public, you still have to send a signal that you're willing to see what you can do to negotiate something. But if you make it too public, and you immediately lead to the types of ransom demands that you can't meet. So this is a very fine line. But yeah, they're traded among the warring parties literally like bread.
We have one particular view of what fuels the Syrian war, but in reading your book, you brought it back to a drug which I'd never heard of, which is Captagon. I had no idea drugs were involved in this to begin with, and Captagon in particular, because I don't even know what that is. What is that drug, and how does it play a role in the Syrian war?
Captagon is a drug that is being mass-produced in the Syrian war. It's an amphetamine. It's actually not a new drug. It's one that has been around since the early 60s, was first manufactured in Germany in a company by a company called Chemiewerke Homburg. And it's not so surprising, by the way, that Germany is a source for for amphetamines that get used in wars, because actually in the Second World War, Germany had manufactured an amphetamine called Pervitin, which was used by the German troops in the Blitzkrieg as an amphetamine to essentially stay awake for 4 or 5 days in a row. So this is the use in wars of amphetamines is not a new thing. It was used for about 20 years as a drug to fight narcolepsy and some other issues until it was retired by the medical community in the early 90s because it had these terrible side effects, including high toxicity levels in the blood and in the heart, which caused death. So it is treated as a highly dangerous substance since the early 80s. The insidious advantage of Captagon is it's very easy to manufacture. If you have sort of a high schooler's chemistry kit and a scale, you can manufacture Captagon. And it is being mass produced in Syria really since before the war, but certainly since the war started in 2011. It's being exported all over the world. It's created an epidemic of unbelievable proportions in Saudi Arabia, with a huge part of Saudi males under 25 are addicted to Captagon. It's become a party drug. It's become something high schoolers use to stay awake and it's caused deaths. It's made its way into Europe. Not too long ago, the Italian police seized 16 tons of Captagon, multiple billions of market value, and they're often sold in blister packs to make it look like medicine. So it's actually shocking to me now. Media in the last few months has become alert to it and started to write reports about it. But this has been around for a while. But it's kind of very similar to how we cover these wars, which is if we assume that it's ring fenced and these are just problems that stay in the country, we don't really care too much. Once they spill out through refugees or these kinds of exports of drugs, suddenly we start to pay attention to it. And it's no different here. But Captagon is not a new drug. That's what's so shocking about it. It's, of course, at this point, you have counterfeit, you have lead Captagon also that's caused death, and lead poisonings in little children. So this is one of those very devastating side effects. And the profits of Captagon are so astronomical because they're so cheap to make and manufacture that it's part of keeping this war alive.
You bring some interesting skills to the job that you have, martial arts being one of them, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the one that really jumped out at me was your sense of smell. You can smell fear on people. I mean, I thought that was just a kind of an expression, but it's more than that.
I don't want to sound cartoonish about this. It's a nuanced issue, and I don't want to oversimplify it. Essentially, we all obviously can smell people, and we can smell odors that people emit, and we don't all experience them the same way. We might experience someone will describe a smell as sweet when the other one perceives that smell as rancid. So everyone has an individualized sense of smell. I'm not unusual in that respect. What as a little kid, I would smell certain things that I felt for example, in fights that I would get into as a little kid, where I would smell certain things that I really couldn't put together. I just felt that's just a smell that you have, just like people smell bad if they don't shower for a few days. And it was later on in my life, both through martial arts and then through an Eastern healing art called Jinshin Jitsu, that I started to understand the connection between certain smells and odors that we emit in a disharmonized state, fear being one of them, anxiety, sadness, anger, and how smells correlate to that. So it's years, actually decades of studying this that put it all together to me in terms of understanding things that I had experienced as a little kid. But it's not, I don't mean to trivialize this or turn it into some kind of a superpower thing. It's not that at all. It's just it's part of Eastern healing. It's a conversation for a whole other day. But yeah, definitely it's something I described in the book because it was very relevant to getting through these 20 days. You were offered compensation in this case, but refused to take it. They almost practically shoved money in your pockets. They were so desperate for you to take some compensation for this. Well, why did you refuse it, and why do you refuse it in these kinds of cases? Several answers to that question. The most immediate one is that when you take compensation, you're immediately in the realm of ransom. In other words, when you're being paid, there's always a wink-wink understanding that some of what you're being paid, you're going to use to pay for either information or for release of a hostage. And you can very easily and quickly find yourself crossing a line that you shouldn't cross, where this becomes an illegal activity. And just because governments, including the U.S. government, sometimes wink at this and let other parties, such as certain monarchies in the Gulf, pay for ransom so that everyone has plausible deniability, doesn't mean that I personally want to get caught up in it. I also have a principled opposition to ransom payments. And this is also my own personal background and my own military background, where I believe, as much as these are all heartbreaking situations, the moment you pay ransom for a hostage, there is a direct correlation to 10 more hostage cases for ransom. And it's something you have to consider. I understand how heartbreaking it is to the families, and if you can't compartmentalize the two, you shouldn't get involved in these things. That's number one. Second thing is, when you take any payment, even if it's to cover your travel expenses, and even if then those become grossed up to add a little bit more to compensate you for your time, the moment you open that door, your dynamic with the people who are asking you for help changes completely. In other words, if someone approaches me and says, my son or my husband or my father has gone missing, or a journalist who has worked for us, if you're a media organization, if they ask you for a favor and you say, well, I'll see what I can do, and you don't accept any payment, you do it entirely on your terms. And you can say, for example, my condition is you don't talk to others, or my condition is if you talk to others, you give me advance notice of that. And the moment you breach that, I walk away from it. Once you're being paid, there is initially an implicit and usually explicit understanding that if we pay you, you get to do what we do, and you don't get to be picky about how you do it. And it changes dynamics entirely. And while that is understandable in a different commercial context, when you deal with people's lives, you find yourself very quickly in situations that are emotionally so fraught. It's already so painful to interact with families of missing ones because they're obviously at their wits' end. That the best thing you can do is keep this really at the level of just seeing what you can do to help a person. And if it works out well, then the happiness of everyone involved is really all the pay you want. And my costs are really not high, so it's not like there's a need to be compensated. I find myself in that region for my work any which way, so it's not like there are additional travel costs. If there are, they're minimal. And so this is the much cleaner and easier way also emotionally to do it.
Well, there's the whole risking your life thing.
Well, that's on me, and if I'm going to take it on, it's my obligation to do it in a way that is safe, that I know what risks I'm taking. And there are certainly situations. I've been to Syria several times, and I don't describe it in this book because I was asked not to describe it by the Syrian friends who helped me travel into Syria now, because I didn't want to out them through it. But there are other situations where I know that someone's been taken, especially in the northeast of Syria, where I would have to travel there to get more information, let alone negotiate, and I can't do it because it's simply too dangerous. It's an area still controlled by ISIS, and so I have to simply decline. So that's on me to manage my risk and decide what I can do and what I can't do. I don't do this recklessly. I don't just get on a plane and start walking into war zones.
If you don't pay ransom, what leverage do you have?
Let me give you a metaphor. So if you're a surgeon and you perform a surgery on a patient, you have to put the infusion in the patient's arm before you do the surgery. If you wait for the surgery to start, then the blood pressure has dropped and you can't find a vein. And it's the same thing when you're dealing with ransom negotiations. Follow me here. What I mean with that is the only way to be able to even just get information, let alone negotiate a release, is through a network of friendships and favors and counter favors, sometimes directly with someone, sometimes through one or two other people, that you can cash in at the moment that you need them. And those are friendships of 10, 20, 30, even more years. There is a Syrian army officer whom I first met when I was in the Israeli army in the late 80s, early 90s. We've stayed friends since then for over 30 years. And what I've been able to do for him, what he's been able to do for me, is kind of a web of relationships and favors. And those chips are the ones you can use. So once you're not just going out dispensing suitcases full of cash, it's only those kind of favors. And it can be, as an example, that someone says to me, listen, I know who can get us information, but the person's mother-in-law needs chemotherapy in Germany. It's the only place that has the proton beams for her. I can't take her out there because I'm sanctioned by the U.S. Is there any way you can arrange for that trip? And if I can arrange for that, as an example, then that's the kind of favor you can do. Money doesn't have to change hands at all. It's really just the kind of favor. It's very often indirect. And it's that kind of web that initially gets you information. Once you're negotiating a release, it's a whole different ballgame. And then, of course, the types of favors have to go up. In most cases, you can't do something directly for the person asking. It has to be through someone else.
I've been deliberately not asking you a lot of details about the specific story because I don't want to spoil it for the readers, and it's quite an intense story. But you do meet with some pretty unsavory characters where I would think you had to believe your life was in danger going out and talking to some of these folks, but you don't go armed. The only thing you're armed with is your smartphone, which you're using to try to record the conversations, which seems like a pretty dangerous idea in itself. Where do you get the nerve to do this? And is there a point when you're doing it where, it's like, was it Jaws where we're going to need a bigger boat, where you realize, this is not going to work. I got to get out of this.
The two types of situations in the book that there's a certain sort of physical danger. The first one is a night in Beirut, without giving any spoilers, where I really had to be willing to cut myself off communication, where I'm surrendering my cell phones, and I'm putting myself at the mercy of the people who are taking me to a particular source of information, and I'm end up having to meet a very powerful, prominent, both political and militia leader in Beirut. The reason I decided to take on that risk was that the introduction happened through a person I trust with my life, and who has never ever disappointed me. And I knew that if he recommended that I go on that trip, that he would make sure that I was safe, and I trust him completely. That's the one kind of risk. The other kinds of risks that you allude to before, in terms of the people I have to meet, are some extremely unsavory characters, people in the human and drug trafficking business. There, the way you mitigate the risk is in two ways. One is that I try to always meet them in a public spot. I'm not going to go to a place where I'm simply alone with someone. And that's a very powerful risk mitigation tool. And the second one is, in particular, later on, that's one situation in Amman, Jordan, then in Dubai later on, where I find myself face to face with a very unsavory character, where I did create backup plans and escape plans in case things went wrong. I was still in a very public spot with him, but to the extent I would see, for example, that he had been alerted to me or considered me hostile, that I would have a way to get out of that public spot in a way that was safe. So those are the two types of ways, and that's a reasonable way to mitigate that risk. Again, this is not the kind of risk where I'm parachuting into a war zone completely cut off from any contacts. This is a manageable kind of risk.
Yeah, but still, some of these guys are pretty rough characters. What's the closest, most dangerous situation you found yourself in doing this work? Have you almost been kidnapped before?
Yeah, that has happened, and so I have to decide whether. There are obviously other situations where I might be armed, and there was one situation in this book in Beirut on the way back to the airport when I'm leaving Beirut, where we drive into a roadblock, and there is an armed group that comes to check who I am in the car. It's not an official government group, but I was actually in the car with a person from that group, so that ended up being resolved peacefully, but it could have ended badly. Yeah, there are certainly those moments can occur.
I was amazed when you find some of these people that you're looking for, and I'm reading along, and I thought, oh my gosh, he's about to meet so-and-so. How is he going to even get a conversation going with this person, much less get the information you're looking for? Are you just one of these people that can sit down and people just start talking to you?
I don't think so. First of all, I think it's always dangerous to describe oneself because usually we're wrong about how we perceive our skills. So I can't really answer that. There are two elements to this. One, I describe, I think, both in the book. The first one is that just because someone is evil, it's a mistake to assume that they're dumb. And just because someone may not speak good English, for example, again, doesn't mean in any way that they're not intelligent or shrewd. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. We often make these kinds of odd conclusions the same way we assume that people who are wealthy might be good politicians. That's a totally different skill set. It doesn't mean it one way or another. They might be, but not because of that. And so when I interact in these kinds of situations, I try to apply this in other walks of life, not always successfully, but in these situations, I always assume that I can be outplayed. I describe in the book, I say that if you're around a table playing poker and you don't know who the sucker is, chances are it's you. Same kind of thinking here. I go into these rooms. These people didn't become extremely wealthy drug lords or militia leaders by being dumb. And so I don't march into their thinking that I can outwit them. So then you have to decide, what is it that I have that they might find interesting or might enjoy? In some cases, there's something you can offer them, or in some cases, you just get an immediate rapport. The safest way usually is through flattery. In other words, someone's wearing a nice watch and you say, man, that's the most amazing, whatever, Rolex or whatever it is. There's one such situation in the book I mentioned. And especially in the end, when I run into this very unsavory character, my final stop to finding out the information that I'm looking for, it's very clear. I can't intimidate him. I can't bait him with anything because he's powerful and wealthy. And the only way I can start any kind of rapport is by flattering him and hoping him that through that flattery, he'll sort of brag this information and get it out of him that way. Sometimes that works. It's safe in the sense that very few people, it does happen. I describe one person in the book too, but it's very few people who really realize that they're being played if you flatter them. It's an odd thing, no matter how smart someone is. We all, as human beings, seem to be susceptible to flattery, and certainly if someone can figure out the right tone. So that's the way you can start a conversation. Then it evolves. I will say also, especially with the last person I meet, as evil as he was, it was also pretty fascinating talking to him because his insights into the war and the war dynamics and who was benefiting and how this war would last were fascinating. They were a lot more insightful than the most, qualified pundits that we have on our think tank or TV circuit here in the West. And so for me, these are conversations I'm also genuinely interested in. I'm interested in hearing the views of such people, as abhorrent as they might otherwise be.
When you go off on one of these missions, how much does your family know about what you're doing? And do you, I hate to even bring it up, do you leave a note behind of where you're going or who you might be meeting with in case, heaven forbid, something happens to you?
No, I don't look at these as suicide missions. I don't want to create the impression that this is what it is. There are other people who do that within the military or outside the military who really put themselves in harm's way where they have to take that seriously. And it would be, wrong at all levels for me to create the impression that anything I do equates to that. It just doesn't. And this is not in some kind of a false modesty of it. We just really need to keep that real. There are situations where my wife is aware of it, mainly because in some cases also the families of hostages call, and I have to engage with these with families. It's hard for me to really hide it. In this particular case, I didn't share it with my wife for a number of reasons, and I took that confidentiality really seriously also there. But we have an understanding when it comes to that, and my wife is a journalist by training, so she certainly understands. Just like she protects her sources, that same thing may here. So we've created sort of a separation there. I think there's certainly an understanding about what I do. She also has my word that I don't take on risks I should not take on. So I think we have a pretty clear understanding of each other there. That doesn't mean I don't communicate with certain people to make sure that if something goes wrong, that they know where I am and can start a process to extricate me. That does happen, but those are people who are professional in this type of business.
If someone comes to you tomorrow with a missing person story, even with everything that you went through in this particular story, you'd consider it?
My inclination would be to say no. I'd consider it under certain circumstances. If I feel, first of all, if I have a connection to the family, or if the person asking me has a connection to the family, then I would consider it. I would make a few phone calls to see if I even have a shot at helping. And if I didn't, though, I would be much faster than I was a few years ago in saying that I had to decline, unfortunately.
Well, the work you do is amazing, and the story that you write in Proof of Life is certainly amazing, too. Proof of Life, 20 Days on the Hunt for a Missing Person in the Middle East, is available locally at the Novel Neighbor in Webster Groves. Daniel Levin, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it. Stay safe.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure talking to you.